This is the second last session. I shall give a quick feedback, not feedback, a quick run through as to what we've done over the past two sessions of last week for those who are not fully available. And then subsequently also for the physical session that we had in May. So remember, this particular session is designed to now move fully into qualitative elements. The past two sessions were just to provide for you a clear understanding as to how we look at risk. You remember the nodes, how we try and identify hazards. If you remember the ImpactSF analyzer, and we shall go through that. The main key things for today is we shall show you the depth of material which you can get from what we've showcased over the past two modules. And then subsequently, we'll go and give you a template MIS or management information system, which you can go ahead and embed onto your current workflow. Now, I think it's important for us to understand that we are not, the approach which we are taking is not to overhaul the whole process that each of your institutions has, or if you're a bank or a financial or an insurance, but it's designed to go ahead and improve and enhance basically your lending and your origination strategy. So this is just a feel as to what we've done since session one, which was last week, Tuesday. We explored elements of probability of default. That's what PD there means again. And then loss given default. We went ahead and also in session two talked about the green finance product. I think we explored that quite extensively with regards to what a green loan is, the components, and how to design one. We also did indicative product sheets and just very high level strategies. Now, today we're going to go fully and now convert the information that we did have last session into this session. Remember, we're still dwelling with the tomatoes from East Shewa to go and have a clear understanding as to what we can do. Now, in terms of the session structure, I think we've explored that, but what is important here is to understand the output tool that we are looking at. This is, we're going to look at your far right-hand side. So the main thing at the end over here is we are going to be looking at your risk screen worksheet, your decision matrix, and your MIS template, and then obviously the action plan. Now, going back into the analyzer, if you recall this particular picture on the bottom left-hand side, the first thing that we identified was that we would need to do a suitability analysis of that particular value chain area. The main purpose for this is to ensure that the crop that you're planting in that area is favorable. Granted that there are in some cases whereby we've seen that even despite of it having, say, low rainfall, etc., adaptation mechanisms such as, say, irrigation or improved seeds and agronomic practices have been kept in place to try and basically create a false environment for that value chain. But those are elements we also take into account when we go to doing investments, irrespective of the final beneficiary in terms of capital. So in this case, the main thing here is that we're trying to establish that in that value chain, in that particular area, is its typical domain. So we would not expect to begin saying tomatoes in a very hot area unless it's a greenhouse and the like, and so on and so forth. So once we've confirmed the suitability, and one of the scores here is on this top right-hand area, which you'll find is the mean average of these multiple squares. Mind you, these square blocks are 3 by 3, so 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers in terms of measurement. So the idea here is to get what we call a very good analysis of the region, or what we call polygons, to try and demystify whether that particular crop is essential for them. Once that has been done, you remember the second element was for us to go and address and identify the hazards in the particular area. If you recall right, the main thing, just spanning back, would be that we would need to be able to navigate between these time periods here. When you do that, this particular agronomic climatic hazards actually do change from the system, because basically it's a forecast. So we would go ahead, and this is just a quick recap as to basically what we've done for the past 2 or 3 sessions, is that we would identify the hazard. In this case, we're talking about drought or floods or heat stress. We'll identify the exposure in terms of what is happening there. Remember, go back to the node effect. The sensitivity, that's where the system begins providing, if you recall, the various yield analysis over the past 5 years, and then now forecasting according to the climatic elements, and assuming that the farmer does not change their agronomic practices, the different changes in yield or even costs. Finally, we went ahead, once we've identified the hazards, exposures, and the sensitivities, and done the proper costing of the solution, we'd go ahead and now begin putting that onto our financial model, which I shall show you here. And then finally here, begin performing some advanced levels of finance structuring to understand the probability of default and how much, even from an insurance standpoint, should the portfolio, in this case, remember, we're talking about a portfolio, but it would work the same also for a single loan transaction, should be hedged or mitigated, for lack of a better word. Now, before we even jump into that, one of the key challenges that we will always have is that we shall have several hazards. So coming back to this slide, we shall have several hazards. And a hazard here means just basically a problem. So we can have drought, flood, heat stress, all that. But at the same time, we shall have several solutions. So it's important, and this goes back now to the system that we do have, to rank those hazards in terms of a loss proposition, and then go ahead and rank the costing of that solution, and then arrange the best way as to how to address the problem. So I can give an example. In this case, we're talking about tomatoes. So we might come and find that the hazard here is drought, floods, heat stress, disease outbreaks. But we would then go ahead and check, and it's not on this side of the system, the probability of drought over the next season, the probability of the flood coming over the next season, heat stress, disease outbreaks, so on and so forth. Now, those probabilities are not the same. You would find that drought, probably you'd find you've got a 72% probability. Heat stress, you might find you've got, because of drought, obviously it's going to be also elevated, say about 64%. Heat stress would be essential, especially for wiltable crops or even livestock. Floods, given that we are expecting drought, would be probably at 2, 3, 4%, unless we're expecting flash floods. Disease outbreaks, we would expect then say it's going to be at 32%. Now, once you've understood those probabilities, you then go ahead and do the costings of the solutions. And these are the solutions which would probably be there. So you're talking about improved irrigation, as we've talked about here, improved seed varieties, organic fertilizers, so on and so forth. So once you've been able to go ahead and attach those two figures together, then you can be able to get what is called your expected loss when you just multiply those two together. And then now, through that particular system and a bit more financial approaches, you're able to go ahead and rank your top 5 elements which you need to be able to address, and then go ahead and then begin addressing them one for one. So let me pause at that because we're going to jump into some financial figures and just confirm if there are any queries or questions that the audience has. And then we can be able to address them over the next 1 to 3 minutes. So I cannot see the chat. So if there are any questions there, feel free to ask. Otherwise, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. And we've got another 3 to 4 minutes for this.
We have a question. What is
Okay.
your ground to reach at some risk occurrences probability figures? Theodros, you can unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Maybe in risk management, big question is to calculate or to reach at some figure that is the probability of the occurrence of some risk. So from the agricultural perspective, how do you reach that? You can say this 7% or 15% or some figure. So what is your ground to define the risk probability for a given hazard?
Okay, so remember that our organization is basically a science-based organization and it has got the data. So what we do is that we look at historical figures initially to understand the baseline as to what has happened over the past. And then now once we were able to identify the past probabilities, so you'll be able to get for the past, not 20 or 30 years, but for the past 5 years, then we shall go ahead and using this particular approach here for our system, we'll be able to forecast, obviously on the back end of weather and climatic data that we are receiving as to the the, the level of occurrence that it will occur. So let's take, for example, rainfall. So for rainfall, we would probably receive information as we speak also from satellite. Obviously, it begins from satellite and we come down all the way up to the Met station of the particular locale or country. We would be able to understand that we are expecting X amount of rain. So that particular amount of rain, we will measure it against the historical levels on this particular location, and then now try and understand the probability of that amount being lower or higher off than the baseline that we've done. So then that now would give us the understanding of if we are expecting drought, and for the past 5 seasons we've been looking at say 20 mm, but for the forecasted we're looking at a number of iterations because we'll be looking at the number of rainy days which are going to be there. So we shall look if, okay, let me explain this a bit more properly. So we're looking at the tomato value chain. So the tomato value chain, we would have to understand the tomato growth process, and that is our work. So we would understand that you must be able to do land preparation at the right time. You must need to plant the seedling. The seedling would require a particular amount of water at that time period. So if we go back here, excuse me, if we go back here, if you look at the hazard here, we're talking about dry days 31 and then 48 etc. So we're able to understand on those particular day, in that particular period, the number of days or the amount of rainfall which is required to be spread out in a proper fashion for that particular plant to grow adequately. Once we'll be able to understand that, then we can work backwards to understand from the baseline which I had mentioned, the probability of that not being there. So we'll say that we expect 31 days of dry days, but say that the harvest, the growing period within that particular time frame is 60 days. So that basically means we've got a 50% probability it is not going to be meeting the threshold. I hope that makes sense. But the ideal thing here is that you need to understand the crop calendar. You need to understand the amount of water that is required at that particular time. In this case, we just leave it as water. It can get a bit more complicated. And then now we work backwards through math, obviously, to understand whether it's 50, 80, and the like.
That's clear. That's clear. That's very good. But I assumed that we need to follow some probability distribution to determine the occurrence of such a hazard so that we can determine with some sort of standard deviation or some sort of taking the average or the. Okay, maybe I can ask you very detailed in the chat area so that you can continue your lesson. Yeah.
It's fine, but we would typically end up with a standard distribution. But as you know, the points that we would have at that particular time would not have a standard distribution. So we would have to normalize. So we'd have to move, and I don't want to get into heavy mathematics here. So we'd have to move from the Gaussian copula down into a standard distribution model. But that is something we can talk about from the chat box.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Okay. Let me proceed, and then if there are any questions, we can take it on the second half break that we'll have. So from understanding that we are now able to generate this, and do excuse the value chain here was wrong in the case we were dealing with tomatoes, but this is some of the work that we were doing just about 2 weeks ago. Now, by understanding the revenue line, by understanding the costing that is required, and then creating barriers in terms of understanding how basically how that particular investment would behave, we can be able to generate, just from what I've discussed, this very detailed 3-part discount cash flow. Note that we are having a 5-6 year investment horizon here. That is on purpose, and that is deliberate, because by year 3 or 4, as I mentioned in the past in the past modules, the authenticity of that information becomes a bit difficult to understand. So basically, you cannot be able to trust a rainfall session 6 years from today and put it in your model with true authentication. So what we do here is that we run 3-year revolving analysis. So by the time year 3 has reached, and this is why I said it's the transition plan, we would have updated the figures to either look at whether we are underperforming or overperforming. But it is important to also note that we would have been doing this even on a year-by-year basis. So in year 1, which is 2024, 2025, we would have been able to check, have we been able to meet that particular threshold? Go back again on 2025, 2026, so on and so forth. But to recalibrate the whole model and to ensure that the whole model is still within the parameters that we've expected, and I'll explain what that means, then we would do a full model analysis between year 3, year 4, or half of the investment cycle. And what I mean by that is we would be talking about our net present value. So we've done a particular engagement here looking at the net present value needs to be 943. The IRR, or the return for this particular engagement, would be around 28%. And remember, in this case, in as much as we are talking about dollars, we have done a dollar for dollar. So that would also come back into the system. But typically speaking, we also did this in Ethiopian birr, just to make sure that we are having a local currency to local currency matching situation. We'd also look at other metrics in terms of your profitability index, your payback period, and the like. Notice when I mentioned about the 4-year mark in terms of checking whether the model is speaking the truth, it comes back from this analysis. So we need to see that roughly by year 3, are we where we need to be, or we need to go ahead and make significant adjustments or improve on these particular recommended practices that we do have here. Similarly, and I think you went and you were asking this particular question in terms of a distribution. As I mentioned, we bring it down into the standard normal distribution, which is the one which would typically be used by banks and also regulatory entities. And we run a simulation on different drivers. So from price, from the probability distribution of even that rain I start talking about, we'll move it. If you're talking about 50%, we'll put bounds and say we want it to play between 40 and 60% and run 2,500 iterations of that. We would then also go ahead and run iterations on the costings, on the yield also. So if we are expecting a 15% yield improvement over time, we would then definitely go ahead and put a lower bound of 9%, higher bound a bit tighter to the 15 of say 17. Also run 2,500 iterations according to the function formula that we would have done. It's not been showcased here, but that's what basically happens in the background. And the idea for this is for us to understand when we did the analysis over here on the static, we were looking at an NPV of 943. But when we do the Monte Carlo, we begin to see elevated levels because obviously we are playing around with a couple of inputs. And this is important for us because we need to understand the maximum and minimum loan value. So the maximum and minimum loan value would typically not come from the static, but the static would give you the baseline to understand whether the calculations you have on the Monte Carlo simulation are far from the base understanding as to what would typically happen at a particular juncture. Then we'd go ahead and analyze your IRR. Obviously, this is compared against your cost of capital, be it 18, 20%, to try and see whether it is higher and lower. Obviously, in this case, because the NPV or the value that this particular transaction is bringing is positive, then it would have to be higher. And that delta or the difference between the IRR value and the cost of capital would be what would be yielding that improved differential. But we can do more with the data that we've gotten. So what we go ahead and do is we engage in a more in-depth analysis, and it goes back to the question again I think you were asking as to your standard distribution, because from the standard distribution now we can begin to understand clusterings of return values, either through your histogram or through whichever other assessment you want to look at. We can begin understanding your probability of those particular returns in the particular threshold. You can also begin to understand the probability from an area perspective against, say, what would be the return that the bank would demand. So say the bank demands 10% as a minimum return. You can be able to go ahead and put that in your probability section for you to go ahead and understand what are these, basically what we would call them low-hanging, not low-hanging, but fat tail events or low tail events, which would then go ahead and require hedging. So let me go through this one for one. So the first thing that we discovered here is that if we continued as is, we would have a probability, a PD, probability of default of 18%. That comes from down here. If you look at the way lower bit of the Excel, and that comes from the input which I've kept here, which that particular bank was looking to have at that time period. The loss given default was 35 to 45. Then that would mean that the expected loss would be 6.3 and 8. Which is basically a multiplication of the 35 and the 35, 45 on the 18. Now, this is important because remember, when we began this whole engagement, we noticed that the bank can either be underpricing risk, which in this case it was, or it is overpricing risk. And I'll show how that happens, that we can be able to reduce this figure. So assuming that the farmer does not do anything, then the appropriate manner would be to do is to take your expected loss percentage plus your operating cost and your capital charge. So your capital charge would be the cost of capital that the bank raises in terms of from deposit etc., which they can be able to on lend. It's normally provided by the ALM or the ALCO department. And then we would then go ahead and look at obviously the operating costs for the bank, and then also now the target margin. So the amount of net spread which the bank wants to profit from. And then now add this particular basis, which is actually about 1 to 2%, so 100 to 200 basis points for just climatic add-on risk. So that would give you the total end-to-end exposure for that particular portfolio. But you can be able to push this down. Remember, if we said that when we went back to analyze these particular hazards over here, and we found that the most prevalent hazard was drought, because it would be occurring 72% of the time. And we went and got an irrigation kit that was sufficient, we've costed it, etc. So that would mean that 72% would probably drop down to say 10%. Now that should come and affect ideally on the ground. Before we even come to parametric insurance, that should go ahead and affect this whole formula entirely, because then your expected loss would move down from 6.3 to 8.1 down to, let me just give a random guess of say about 2 to about 5%. Currently big. Similarly, also the 100 to 200 basis points here that we are adding on would also be able to be removed to some degree, about say, depending on the weightage of your solution. And I'll leave questions for this section because I know it's a bit weighty. But what is important here is also to understand that how much should you be able to then go ahead and hedge your portfolio? So the hedging of your portfolio through the insurance is important, because you might, in some cases, you could have the luxury to hedge your whole portfolio. But given portfolios are big in terms of size, it only makes sense for you to hedge the particular downside risk. So your left-hand tail, which is showcasing. Remember, this particular events here can show us what the left-hand tails are and understand what particular area or probability is in that section. And you can be able to do what is called a partial risk hedge of that area only, keeping in mind that the wider side of, say, your 80% has already been hedged by on-farm. So even as we are talking about buying insurance or guarantee for the whole portfolio, from a capital sense, it would make sense, not that if you could buy for the whole portfolio, that is good, but in some particular areas, it would be more important for you to hedge on the downside risk, and then a portion of the other side of the portfolio which you believe needs to be hedged if, let's say, the irrigation kit does not function correctly, or there are externalities which happen. Then there are other mitigations to push down the probability of default down in terms of seasonality alignment. I think we mentioned this, either you do an early planting or a late planting, depending on the hazards which you see. Although this is a more technical decision, because we also need to take into account market factors and also other elements such as cultural norms and the like. Also important to mention are working capital top-up triggers, which we can be able to put into that. I'll not explain that because it's a bit technical. And I think I've already mentioned the element of the partial guarantee. Now, in your lending term sheet, you can go ahead and add particular covenants. And this here will be linked to the policy documentation that the insurer has provided. Because remember, there's a policy holder and a recipient. So depending on the structure, at the end of the day, the bank will be the one to receive the payout when there's negative event that has occurred. So you can do very clear climate governance, quality governance in terms of the buyers if you're an outputter and the like. Finally, before we enter into the question section, is that we can begin looking at how much risk we can be able to begin holding per loan. And this goes back then down to understanding your value at risk. Remember what I was mentioning there, we'll be looking at the downside bit if we want to just focus on that. But at the same time, depending on the various regulations per country, Ethiopia is still forming this in that if our loan is sufficiently hedged, according to the various Basel programs that you are in, either Basel 2 or 3, you can be able to play around between, say, 8% to 12% of amount of capital required to be held per loan. So you'll not be required to hold the maximum amount. And then finally, you could go ahead and also understand how to report this from an eligibility standpoint, from a taxonomy. Remember the taxonomy which we were talking about for the past 2 sessions. So let me pause at that. Let me take it back to here and open the floor to any questions or clarifications. And as the questions come, just remember this works in conjunction with what your risk department already gives you. So we're not adding a whole different layer. So it's just for you to understand how this climate does affect your wider portfolio in the long term. I know this is a bit of a lot to handle right now or to absorb, but at the end of the day, it's still the same formulas that you use, whereby it's expected loss is your loss given your exposure at that particular time times the probability of default times the loss given default, and you can play around with that formula in any shape and form, so long as you've got information coming out from systems such as this here. I'd be happy to show the last section. Would be then how do you then go ahead? How does this influence your lending process? So for the lending process, I think we've already gone through this, but I think it was important for us to identify at which integration point. If you look at the far right column, you'd need to include this within the lending profile. So there are elements of, from appraisal, loan origination, then the appraisal, and then so on and so forth. It would be important to know where would you then go and address the expected loss, the DSCR, depending on the bank's DSCR, the hedging mechanisms, and then also the taxonomy tag. But at the end of the day, the point is, once you've understood this process end to end, and especially when you're working with a credible technical partner, you can be able to go ahead and put these values within your loan measuring and quantification module in the bank, and then proceed to go ahead and improve the lending profile. Finally, it would be with regards to elements of the MIS reporting. Remember, it's one thing to do all this work, but it's also very important to go ahead and make a concrete report of the hard work that you've done. So it will be important for you to ensure that the reporting that you do have is in line with, obviously, the regulatory standards. I've given some particular examples here, talking about reduction or increment of yield, reduction of water usage, increment of climate adjusted risk. Even in the bottom here, we're talking about green asset ratio, so on and so forth. So it's and I think it's come from previous examples that it's one thing to do the hard work, which we've basically talked about, and then it's another thing for us to go ahead and do this reporting. But this here is what solidifies the understanding to both the regulator, to both your executive committee, and also to the market, that the bank is actually looking at this from a very green perspective. Finally, before I open the last session for questions, would be some reflections on this. So I think we've already identified very clearly that climate risk is no longer external to finance. You can be able to embed it in every cash flow. It just requires you to understand how these cash flows occur. If you recall, we needed to understand the end to end, depending whether you're production, processing, manufacturing, or export, understand where those nodes of risks occur. Integration is a real innovation, basically what we've done here. So we've done this quite a number of times at various banks across the global south. In this case, now we shall be doing it in Ethiopia. So how to integrate this level of information that we have here and plus more for you to generate a very clear financially linked output, which you can be able to go and also assess, and also going back to the elements of finance of probability risk distributions and the like. Similarly, financial returns improve when resilience is priced in. It's important for you to have the first level of insurance, which we mentioned was the on the farm, your irrigation, your improved seeds, your improved fertilizer, making it organic and the like. So when you do that, this particular farmer and this particular ecosystem, let me put it like that, becomes more resilient to climatic shocks. Climate data is becoming regulatory data. I think that is already known. By the end of 2027, 2028, most banks in the region will be required to have mandatory climate data reporting according to Basel and IFRS. And then finally, it moves from analysis to accountability, because then now you understand your whole portfolio and you're able to go ahead and do particular analysis and also improve it simply because you've understood your whole risk management. But let me pause at that. I know it's been a bit of a heavy session, but I'll be available for any questions and confirmations, both here or on chat before our last session on Thursday.
Pete, we have a couple of questions in the chat. But I also wanted to invite the participants here about the next session will be only Q&A. So you will be able, it will be a clinic and you will be able to bring your questions specific to your case so that we, the facilitator can be able to answer your questions, because we understand that there might be some specific context that you might want to seek clarity or guidance on, and this next session on Thursday at 5 p.m. EAT will allow for that. So we have two questions. I will start with Schiffer. He says, is it possible to do this risk calculation estimation with the traditional risk register used in Excel by adopting Intuit, please?
The traditional risk register, could you just explain, because there are very many add-ons which you can use, but the typical formulas which you can do, that's what we did here. It's just that you need to understand how all those link in, but if you can be able to just expound which particular risk register or add-on you're referring to in Excel.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. What I meant by the traditional risk register is the one used through the Excel and the elongated format across the columns. They used to explain first the problem in short as the first column, then the proportion of that problem, or actually called the risk, is mentioned by some percentage. Then the probability is almost similar with yours. The probability, then the effect or the impact that cause, the mitigation level, even the aggregate risk, and so on. Because it's very innovative, as I've said, because it's not easily explained within short time, if you understood me. So can you adopt it in this? It's more easier for the social science part specifically. That's what I mean, if you got me.
So you would have to add a couple of other elements which would be on the side of the formula. So even if you think about your standard error, your standard deviation, your norm inv, basically I think that's what you're referring to in terms of your formulas, in terms of risk and risk identification. You could use that, but then you'd also, because you're talking about social elements here, you'd have to have other key particular drivers which you would go ahead and stress that particular metric which you're trying to calculate. But all of this here has been calculated by Excel. I hope that helps.
Yeah, more or less, okay.
Okay, the next question.
Yes, from Theodorus, what should be the rollout model / structure among the outgrower, insurance company, and loan underwriter, especially to have this alternative data?
Sorry, what should be the?
The rollout model. Theodorus, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you once again. My question is just the calculation of risk and loan underwriting shall be well integrated with the data of the outgrower, and we can just bring insurance companies so that altogether we can define better loan underwriting procedure. So from your experience, how do you integrate the data interchange amongst outgrower, the insurance company, and the banks or financial institutions for better determination of agricultural risk determination?
Okay, so let me just work on that systematically. So we go back to here. The data from the outgrower, let us assume the key data, not assume, sorry? Okay, so the key data from the outgrower would be, if you think about it, would be the yield data. And that would come from the historical elements. Now, the question is, does the historical element mimic what is going to happen the next season? Let me give a good example. If for the past 3 years, we've not had elevated levels of stress or heat, and we expect that there is going to be excessive rain for this particular next season. So we look at this particular season, July 2025, 2020, whatever. And then after that, typically there's normally a depressed level of heat, an excess level of so rain, and then an elevated level of heat. So we normally call it in our country. I know it's in Ethiopia it's different, or maybe different, El Nino and La Nina. So if we look at the registry from the outgrower, the outgrower might say that we've only been losing 7%. But we know we've got more information to tell us that that 7% can become 20%. And now we've seen that we can also go ahead and calculate the probability, because by looking at the days depending on the crop cycle. So the first thing to do is you get the data from the outgrower and then analyze it. Does this happen to be data which will continue into the next couple of seasons? Typically not. So what you have to do is that you must first and foremost provide this new particular information and then stress that information against, if you recall, this particular Monte Carlo simulation. So you'll still work with if the Aurora gave you the 9%, but you'll use that 9% as the floor. Then you shall put now the data is telling you between 9% and say 24%, and then now run various binomial modes on that, or binomial tree distributions, to understand the actual yield which we should be able to expect, and then now calculate against 2,500 outputs your NPV. The bank data also is always historical. And that is, it goes without saying. So the bank data is historical. Once again, the same thinking. The bank says that we have been having probability of defaults of say about 12%. Yet you know 70, you've got a 70% surety that the next 3 seasons, the level of in this case, the rain is going to be a bit depressed. So that means that the 8% that the bank has told you cannot be the same probability of default moving forward, even if the bank has collected collateral, because it means that the bank has collected collateral to lose up to 8%. But what if now, with the new information, you understand that that 8% is ideally actually supposed to be 17%. That means the bank has got a 9% differential delta, which is unhedged technically for simple math reasons. Insurance also, in some cases, it's going to be historic. Some of them, it's going to be forecast, having a forecasting nature. So what we've seen is that for insurance, they would, in some cases, when they're using value chains which they're quite familiar with, they'll use basically the past couple of seasons. But when it's a new value chain, they would have to go and create a new product, and they would have to actually go and get data which is forward seeking. So you would find that insurance would be the one which would have the nearest level of present day information depending on which side of the system they work. Now, the idea here is to present this level of analysis and data. Obviously, as I mentioned, you need to work with a technical entity that has got science background and the like to be able to run through this. And then once that has been done, and I think we've never seen this as a challenge, is now to be able to go and either re-hedge or restructure how the lending product looks like, or restructure the whole portfolio if we are looking at massive levels of losses over the next 3 or 4 years. So just to answer your question, the data that we would get, we'll still collect it. But now again, remember, the purpose is to enhance the data that is collected with new pieces of information and new approaches of transaction design and structuring. I hope that is clear. Happy to explore via email later on.
That's perfect.
But for that, let me bring it to a close. And thanks once again for your attendance. Thank you.